you ever seen Firestop spray installed at the head of wall joint where they're spraying against fireproofing? If you've seen enough of it, you've probably seen some images that look more like a scene from a horror movie, and some that look like sheer artwork. But you can't judge the Firestop installation just based on what it looks like at first glance. I've seen the bloodbath installations that actually conform to the requirements of the Firestop detail better than the pretty stuff. So how are you supposed to know what's good and what isn't? Well, welcome to our topic today. In the next 10 or 12 minutes, I'm going to go over this with you. And when we're done, you'll know the key things to look for when assessing Firestop spray installation, especially against fireproofing. But this might not be what you expect. Let me explain what I mean by way of introduction. My name is Sharon, and I'm with Halpert Life Safety Consulting. I'm not an engineer, but I've been in the Firestop industry for over 20 years now. Before that, I taught kindergarten. And that explains why my training is a little different. Let's face it, building codes and fire test standards are going to be boring to most people. That's why when you have a kindergarten teacher who totally geeks out about codes and standards, your lessons are going to be different. You'll see what I mean. In this video, we're going to explain what you need to look at anytime you see Firestop spray installations. Now, the same way that kindergarten classes have rules, so does Firestop. Keep your hands to yourself, choose kind words, don't cut in line. Those are just a few rules in any kindergarten classroom, right? They kind of apply today, too. So, Firestop rules that I'm going to share with you, they're the same. It doesn't matter which manufacturer you're using. These rules are steadfast and universal with every manufacturer that I've ever seen. But remember, if you find a Firestop detail that says something contrary to anything that you hear in any of these videos, go with that, because manufacturers are testing new things all the time. And as long as you have the most up-to-date Firestop detail, you're going to be good. But there are 4 rules as we know them today, and they are: rule number 1. Firestop spray is always installed 1/8 of an inch wet. It's 50% water, so it'll cure and shrink to a 1/16 of an inch, and that's totally fine. But I'm going to refer to it as 1/8 of an inch because that's what the installers need to pay attention to. If you're inspecting it, then the required thickness depends on is it wet or fully cured? That brings us to the second rule. Firestop joints are a connection of 2 rated assemblies, so the Firestop spray needs to be installed with a 1/2 inch overlap on each of those assemblies. It may be concrete, block, or drywall, for example. Next, the Firestop spray needs to overlap onto any fireproofing by 2 inches. These overlaps will have to be 1/8 of an inch as well. A sidebar in fireproofing. When I use the term fireproofing in this video, I'm referring to spray-applied fireproofing, the white popcorn-looking stuff. If your field application has some other form of fireproofing, such as a coating that looks like a thick paint, then you'll need to find a Firestop detail that allows for that material. I'm not sure what the overlap requirements would be, if they're different. You'll have to look into that further if that's what you have on your project. If you need help, let me know. Finally, Firestop spray is always installed with mineral wool. You see, the spray on the fire side of the wall is sacrificial. It'll burn away in no time flat. I mean, if you've watched the other videos, you see 5 minutes, the temperature inside the fire test furnace is going to be 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The stuff is gone. If you want to know more about fire-rated assemblies and how they're tested, we have separate videos on that for you. Just give us a shout and we can get those to you. So the spray on the Firestop, it's not going to last very long, but the spray on the non-fire side, that's the hero in this story. It holds the mineral wool in place, and it's critical to passing the various requirements that fire tests have to endure. Now, we know there are some installers who are hacks, and we know there are others who are sheer artists. Let's talk about the artists and what they do before we tear the hacks apart. That way, you understand why each element is so important. But let me give you an image to work with. Do you know what this is? Yeah, it's a Band-Aid. If you've used one of these before, then you know that some of them stick forever and some fall off in under an hour if you so much as sneeze. So that should help you with the image that I want you to have in your head. Now, when the artist does this Firestop installation perfectly, what's it going to look like? You know the requirements, we've gone over them. So let's start with this one. We say that the Firestop spray has to overlap onto the drywall, block, or bare concrete a half an inch. If you look at our Band-Aid, there's this part that's supposed to cover your cut, and then there are these sticky wings, right? Have you ever used a tiny Band-Aid, one with short little wings? They don't stay on very well, do they? That's because the adhesive doesn't have enough to hold on to. It doesn't have enough bite. But let's go back to our Firestop spray. We said it needs a half-inch overlap, right? Well, that overlap needs to be the full 1/8 inch depth so that it can actually stick to the surface. What if we tried to stick our Band-Aid to an arm covered in baby powder or sunscreen? It's not going to stick very well, is it? Of course, the surface that's receiving your Firestop spray, it also needs to be clear of any dust or debris, such as drywall dust or concrete form oil. That way it can stick to the wall or the concrete and not to the dust and the oil. I've seen some installers use tape to mark off the half inch, and that'll give it a clean cut look. It eliminates the overspray. But this is not a requirement, it just looks good. What was one of the other requirements? We said we need to have a 2-inch overlap on the structural fireproofing. But 2 inches, really? Yep, you need 4 times as much overlap because you're dealing with fireproofing. But why is that? Well, there's a few reasons. For that, let's go back to our Band-Aid again. Let's say we're running through the woods and a small twig scratches your arm. You have to put on a white shirt after you take a shower, but you don't want it to bleed through onto your shirt, so you're going to put a Band-Aid on. If you put a Band-Aid on my arm, it'll stick pretty well. Unless it's one of those cheapo Band-Aids, right? But what about somebody with a hairy arm? You can't put some tiny little Band-Aid on and expect it to stick through a lot of hair. You're going to need a larger Band-Aid if you want to have any hope that it'll have any sticking power. Let's say, at the end of the day, you want to take this Band-Aid off of that hairy arm. If you had a cheapo Band-Aid, well, the cheapo Band-Aid's already fallen off. But if you have a good Band-Aid, one that's got lots of stickum, you're gonna know it when you take it off. Eesh, it's gonna hurt. All that hair is gonna get pulled out because the Band-Aid is gonna stick to your hair better than your hair can stick to your arm. Now, what if instead of a Band-Aid on your arm, I have a 2-inch wide roll of duct tape, a strip that runs the length of your arm, and then I went to pull it off? Don't worry, you don't have to do it. I just want you to get the image because guess what? The fireproofing is going to be the same as that hairy arm. Let me explain it a little bit more. You see, the Firestop spray sticks to the fireproofing better than the fireproofing can stick to the steel or concrete that it's designed to protect. And just like the Band-Aid will stick to your arm hair and rip the hair off when you take it off, let's bring this back to Firestop and talk about a common installation mistake and what that means to the performance of the head-of-wall Firestop joint. This is where we beat up the hacks. Here's the installation we're going to talk about. We have our concrete deck. Now, this could be a fluted metal deck or a flat deck. We're focusing on the fireproofing in the area of the steel beam, so that doesn't matter. So here's our concrete deck and our I-beam, and since it's primary steel, we know that it's going to be covered in fireproofing. This is our gypsum wall, and we know we need to have it framed out. The installation is going to have mineral wool in here. If you have this application, please watch our video on mineral wool so that you know that that element is installed right. Okay, so this is your field condition, right? You have it all framed out, everything's good. Wait, no, that's not your field condition. Oh, so you're telling me that your drywaller didn't frame out the opening? So you have this big box opening, right? No, oh, your drywaller scarfed around like this and then they're gonna spray. It looks like this pink is your drywall? Dude, you've got a problem. If you were going to test this in the lab, it would have to survive the hose stream test, and I'm not comfortable that that's possible. If you've watched the video on the hose stream test, I bet you're second guessing an installation like this yourself. If you want to know what this should look like, check out the video on fire stopping structural members. But right now, let's get back to our spray discussion. I need to redraw this in another orientation. So over here, we've got our I-beam, and then here's your framing member, and then we've got gypsum board on either side of our 1-hour rated wall. So here is our mineral wool packed properly into the opening. like so. Now, let's say as we look at the field installation, we can see that our hack installed a 2-inch wide swath of fire stopping across the fireproofing. They've got the 1/2 inch overlap down onto the wall, and then 2 inches here. Now, I'm using red chalk, but you all know that red stuff is not necessarily Firestop, and that all Firestop is not necessarily red, right? You know this. Of course you do, but I was just saying it. Anyhow, so as you can see, take out our trusty ruler. Our installer, there's our 2-inch. So this 1-inch area is nice and thick. This other second half of our 1-inch, it's just overspray. So that 1/8 inch isn't there. So what happens? Well, you run the risk that when there's movement in the joint, there's going to be so much tension, so much pulling force concentrated in that 1-inch area here, that the movement can actually pull the fireproofing off of the structural steel or concrete that it's trying to protect. However, if you have the 2-inch wide strip that runs the whole length of your arm, your wall, then when there's movement, that tension is dispersed over the entire 2-inch section. I know that's more than 2 inches, bear with me. But it's spread out across that 2-inch by however long area. And that tension won't be enough to dislodge your fireproofing. Just like this thin strip of duct tape is going to take a lot more effort to remove it, this 2-inch wide swath of fireproofing will require a lot more effort as well. So we've talked about the mineral wool. We talked about the required overlaps. The last thing we need to address a little bit more is the thickness of the spray. You know it needs to be installed 1/8 of an inch thick, but how can you judge this? Well, if you can see the fibers of the mineral wool through the spray, then you know it's too thin. True story. I was on a job site one time, and I could actually see the texture of the mineral wool. The layer of spray was so thin. The installer told me that the mineral wool was absorbing the spray because the manufacturer had been playing with the formula and there was more water in it than before. We are not going to get into how many layers of wrong that is. I just want you to know what happened once this material cured. You could see small pockets of mineral wool. Not the texture of the fibers, but actual exposed mineral wool. The spray was way too thin when it was installed, so when it cured, it couldn't even hold itself together. But let's take a moment and talk about what will happen if we don't fix this problem. If you can see the texture of the mineral wool, there's no chance that you're going to have the spray thick enough. The cured spray that's too thin will run the risk of tearing, but thin spray that has holes in it is almost guaranteed to tear without even minimal movement. Let me show you. This is a typical sheet of paper. If I tug on it, you can see it can take a fair amount of force without any damage. Now, let's see if the same paper has a small tear in it. Now, when I tug on the paper, what do you think will happen? And I'm going to use the same force as before. Look how easily it's going to tear. And this is just a piece of paper, so it's no big deal. But what if this is the life safety of your building? It would suddenly be a little more important, right? If you'd like more tips on how to verify the installation is done right, we have another video on that with tips and tricks. If you'd like access to it, just give me a shout. But remember though, that 1/8 thickness has to be the full 1/2 inch onto the substrate or the full 2 inches onto the fireproofing. Because if you only have 1/8 of an inch for part of that, or the rest has holes, then the sealant can tear, or as we talked about, worse, pull the fireproofing off. Keep this in mind when you're dealing with fireproof structural members as well. There's a whole lot more to go on that. So, well, you guessed it, we have another video on that topic as well. So the topic would be structural elements. You'll be amazed at how often things are done wrong, and we showed you a couple in our video today. But we want to hammer that home a little bit more. So thank you for taking time to learn about Firestop. My goal is to keep these relatively short, but there's so much more that I want to share that I have to keep referring to these other videos, and I'll help you connect the dots as you keep learning. Remember, if you have any questions, or if there's any way that we can support a project that you're working on, don't hesitate to give us a call. We're happy to help or connect you with someone who can. Thanks for your time.